Okay, everyone. We're going to look at William Wordsworth today, we said. And with Wordsworth, we're looking at the Romantic period for the first time. We were looking up to this point at the Enlightenment, and now we're looking at the Romantic period. The Romantic period historically begins probably with the publication, at least in England, with the publication of the Lyrical Ballads, which was written by this man, William Wordsworth, and his friend Samuel Taylor Coleridge. But that is, the date for that is 1798. Lyrical Ballads were published for the first time, and that announces the Romantic movement in England, with the publication of that. But it's debatable when the Romantic movement begins, in part because it's more than a poetic movement, it is a movement of thought. And so often you will see a part of the understanding of what constitutes Romanticism is in the definition or in the political developments of the French Revolution, which are 9 years before this. So in 1789, in the French Revolution, so I don't know where you are in your history class. Is anyone doing first year history now? Yeah. And have you done the French Revolution yet? I thought so. In 1798, there's the storming of the Bastille, which is the prison for largely political prisoners, but all sorts of people are thrown into the Bastille prison. And the prison becomes a sort of a symbol of the tyranny of the French state, the crown. And so when the prison is stormed, it's part of a whole cycle of events that concludes with the execution of the king, Louis XIV. His head is chopped off. Actually, it's Louis XVI. He's executed, and a political revolution begins. And there is the whole series of events leading up to that, which you've dealt with in your history class, so I'm not going to repeat here, but it's the common people rising up against the aristocracy and the clergy and bringing about a revolution. The first of many violent, bloody revolts, bringing about a modern political period. So it's called the French Revolution, and to some degree the aims of the French revolutionaries are symbolized in their motto, Liberté, Fraternité. Sorry. Égalité. Liberty, equality, fraternity. So one of the hallmarks of this period, including the Romantic periods, is a reference to liberty, which has a strong resonance and has strong connotations in the English-speaking tradition already. If you think back to Paradise Lost, which we've already studied, the importance of liberty in Milton, who writes a book, or rather a tractate called Areopagitica, which is a defense of free speech, and the parliamentary system and the right of due process and equality before the law. There's an English-speaking tradition of freedom, which already exists in England, and here we have another appeal to freedom. And one of the questions that arises is what is meant by this word freedom, because it can differ quite widely. And freedom is prized by the left and the right, by the conservatives and by the progressives, if you will. But it's from this period that we associate the left wing with the progressives or the revolutionaries, because in the French three estates, the parliament, it's in a sort of a semicircle concave, and on the left is the third estate, which is the radicals, and they're on the left wing. So to this day we speak of them as the left wing, and we associate the aristocrats and the clergy with being right-wing just simply because they're not the left-wing. So it persists to this very day. These are terms of the French Revolution. Even if they no longer apply, we still use those terms. And I don't think they do apply, actually. Unless you think that the Nazis were the clergy and the aristocrats, and I don't think that that is remotely true. But still, those sort of labels apply. But this is a significant event in the life of not just the French, but also all the countries in Europe. And the execution of the king in France had political reverberations all over Europe. So there was talk of the same sort of political consequences in England as well. That never happened. But the Romantics were sympathetic to it. So Mr. Wordsworth, at the time he's writing his lyrical ballads, is sympathetic to the French Revolution and the aims of the French revolutionaries. And he went to France himself, and not long thereafter. Before he came to write the lyrical ballads, he was in France as a tourist, as it were, wanting to be a part of it. Eventually, he was repulsed by what happened in the French Revolution, which it gave way to what was called the Reign of Terror. The Reign of Terror being the revolutionaries having executed the king and the aristocrats, and many of the clergy put leaders in charge, and the leaders weren't radical enough for those underneath them, and so they began another bloodletting. So the revolutionaries ate their own. This has been a pattern of the political left ever since. Happened in Soviet Russia as well. So the pattern of overturning people in positions of authority, putting new people in authority, and then what's the legitimacy they have? Well, they have to listen to the people, and the people are never happy with the status quo. So that only gets dissolved when Napoleon Bonaparte comes into power, and we have basically a military regime. And then he marches around Europe bringing about the French Revolution by overthrowing the other governments of the day. I've gone off on a bit of a historical lesson there, but I think there is some importance to the French Revolution here. But this poem that I'm going to look at first is from this preface to Lyrical Ballads. I erased it there, from 1798, and it is the first poem, I believe. Lines composed a few miles above Tintern Abbey. Yes, I have it there. And I will erase this now so you can actually see it. And I want to talk a little bit about the aesthetic aspect of the Romantic movement. Now, the Romantic movement is sympathetic to the political ambitions of the French Revolution, but it doesn't, they aren't, strictly speaking, or only political writers. In fact, I don't think that that's the dominant feature of the Romantic movement. The dominant feature is that there's also an aesthetic revolution. So the heroes of Romantic writing are not aristocrats. They're not kings, they're not princes, they're not knights. They tend to be commoners, common people. In fact, not only common people, they tend to be unlikely common people. They will be mad mothers. There's one poem by Wordsworth called The Idiot Boy. It was a boy with mental health issues. Idiot is pejorative these days. It would not be as pejorative in Wordsworth's day. Idiot is somebody who is only aware of themselves. That's the Greek sense of the word idiot, actually. So sort of I guess we call it autistic these days, and it's similarly similar connotation. So the idiot boy, but the idiot boy is the hero of the poem, and we will also find that the typical Romantic heroes are socially marginalized or outcast people. We didn't do the Blake poems because of we overran from snow days and stuff like that. But Blake's heroes are also children. So in the Romantic movement, the child becomes a typical hero, which is unprecedented in literature. There's no precedent for children being the heroes of literary works before this time, but they become so very commonly hereafter. Nowadays, much of our literature has children as heroes. Well, that's a revolutionary in itself. And I'll come to that when we look at the second poem, The Intimation Zone, and a quotation by Wordsworth on that front. But we'll also get social outcasts being heroes. So criminals, poets, vagrants, wanderers, isolated individuals, these become the characteristic heroes of Romantic fiction. So a new type of hero enters the frame. So not the sheriff wearing the white, but the guy wearing the black hat, the bad guy, because the bad guy has been misunderstood or marginalized in some way. So there's the beginning of what we now recognize as a victim culture. The victim culture is being, to some extent, promoted by the Romantic movement. So the weak, the powerless, the marginalized, the misunderstood, even the criminal is promoted as having a legitimacy in this period. It's an overturning of the norms, whether it's because of economic reasons, social reasons, or even moral reasons. So we also get the indulgence in the Romantic period increasingly of people who are immoral in their conduct as being in some sense heroic. With the second generation of Romantics, with Lord Byron, we even get a sort of satanic heroism. And remember I said to you, one of the questions about Milton's Paradise Lost is who the hero is, and it was the Romantics who said that it was Satan, which no Christian would ever say, and never would have occurred to Mr. Milton. But it does occur to us as well for a variety of reasons. Theologically, of course it's impossible. And yet, we tend, when I say we who fall in the wake of the Romantic movement, tend to give at least a consideration of whether Satan might have a claim for heroism in some way. Claims to be misunderstood, claims that God is a worse villain than he is. That's his claim. It's a lie, but that's his claim. There's sympathy for the devil in the Romantic period. So much so that Lord Byron's heroes, who we're not going to look at, are typically, they're actually even called Byronic heroes, are satanic figures. And Lord Byron himself was often, it's almost autobiographical. His heroes were often modeled after himself. I think it was Lady Hamilton that said he was mad, bad, and dangerous to know. So he was the bad boy. So the beginning of the contemporary rock star, where, they're sex, drugs, and rock and roll, that begins in the Romantic movement to some degree. And the attraction to the bad as a misunderstood, oppressed individual, sympathy for such figures, that is in this period. Along with it, there's an overturning of aesthetic sensibilities. So a delight in darkness as opposed to the light. An emphasis on obscurity as opposed to clarity. And if you go back to the Enlightenment, it's all about light and clarity and reason. In the Romantic movement, there's a preference for shade or even darkness. There's a preference for the victim or the marginalized as opposed to the heroic, and there's a preference for the imagination as opposed to reason. And that's actually almost the main distinguishing feature of the Romantic movement, is they all talk about the importance of the imagination. And it's from the Romantics that we, to this day, get our, at least the dominant cultural view of what constitutes good writing, which is imaginative, creative, individual expression. We'll talk about a bit more about that as we go through some of the other Romantic poets and as we go through this as well. But I want to actually pay attention to the poem and not just talk in abstraction. But those are the sort of the general contours of it. Let me make one final comparison, and it's comparing the poetics and the aims of the writer before the Romantics and the aims of the writer after the Romantics, and including the Romantics. The aims of the writer before the Romantics, and I'm taking this from a scholar by the name of M.H. Abrams. He was writing in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And he wrote a book called The Mirror and the Lamp. And I'm just bringing it to your attention because I think it's helpful just as a way of grasping the shift. Historically, the poet sought, and this is to use Shakespeare's words, to hold a mirror, as it were, to hold a mirror up to nature and show her her true self. That was the poet's aim. Or in Horace's words, through like a picture make. So to create an image like as if it were a picture. So a visual image or a visual image created by words that would draw up an image in the mind of the audience. So you're trying to imitate. Imitation is the aim. Or if you prefer, a representation of reality. And the representation was something that you could visualize. That was the emphasis, historically, classically. So when you're reading Homer's Odyssey and Homer's describing a scene, you're supposed to be able to visualize what he is depicting. And one of the things that he's depicting always are external objects. We never get any interest in what's going on in Odysseus's mind. Right? There's no internal monologue. There's not, or if there is, it's a narrator's comment. It's not the thoughts of the protagonist. Same in the biblical accounts. When Abraham goes to sacrifice his son, who he's been waiting for his whole life, we're not told what he's thinking when he's told to go sacrifice Isaac. We're just told that he gets up early in the morning and goes. But when we're reading the account of Abraham and the sacrifice of Isaac, everybody is thinking, what must it be like? I mean, what's he thinking here? Because he's been waiting his whole life for Isaac. This is the child of this is a seed through whom all nations will be blessed. This is the boy, and now God's called upon him to sacrifice Isaac. What on earth is he thinking? We have no idea. Doesn't say in the text. And that's because in this period, or in all literature up to this point, there's no interest in psychology per se. Or if the interest is in psychology, it's expressed in the words and the actions of the character. We know what the character is thinking by what the character does. Never mind anything else. But we're not going to go inside the head of the character, if you see what I mean. There's no stream of consciousness. Stream of consciousness, which you probably write in stream of consciousness because it's a type of writing that only appears in the 20th century, by the way, where you connect your thoughts through hyphens, right? Dashes, because there's a thought and there's another thought and there's another thought, and that's how you write it on the page. You will not find an author write that in that form before the mid-20th century. It just does not exist. And that's because they didn't think that it was worth depicting, or that it wasn't particularly interesting. I happen to agree, by the way. It's not very interesting. It's one of the reasons I didn't like literature that much in school. It was taught is they were teaching novels with streams of consciousness. And I'm like, my gosh, I want some action here. and something I can see, whereas when I come to the Bible, or that was very different. Those are exciting. Those are good stories. Or if I read Homer's Odyssey or the Iliad or the Aeneid or Sir Gawain and the Green Knight or what we've been reading so far, this is good stuff. And there's something profound here as well. It's not just that it's giving an adventure story. There's something really deep going on. But the Romantics, on the other hand, so this is what Abrams calls the mirror. So it's holding up a mirror to nature and reflecting something of it. Now it says holding up a mirror to nature as twere to show her her true self. Now her true self is not simply a photograph. It's the essence of the things being depicted. So for example, the reason that great works of literature still appeal is because even though it's talking about an individual that lived thousands of years ago, we can still identify with that person because that person is in some ways archetypal. I know Jordan Peterson talks a lot about this fact, and he's correct. So the great works of literature aren't just talking about an individual. It doesn't matter if the guy's a Greek. It's that there's something great about that person that remains great. And we identify with that, and we can see it, and we think that it is still intriguing. Same with the biblical characters. They're intriguing. And they remain so because of that. So that's holding up the mirror. So it's depicting a visual image of something that is outside the poet. Whereas, come the Romantic period, Abram says he used the images of a lamp. Well, the lamp has a light that comes from within and shines outward. So it's expressive as opposed to imitative. So if neoclassical aesthetics or even classical aesthetics are imitative and representational, Romantic aesthetics are expressive. And what do they express? They push outwards, literally express. They express the author's feelings. So this is the words and ideas and images, whereas these are expressive of feelings. Now it's called the imagination, but the imagination, as we will see it, is not particularly visual. It's more confused, or it's more obscure, and it's reflected in the painting of the period, by the way. So if you look at the painting before this, it tends to be very, it's very clear. Take neoclassical or even Renaissance painting. The object of representation is front and center. Think about how you often get the Mona Lisa or the Virgin Mary. She's front and center, and there's a sort of a general, I'm not going to put it up just for the sake of time. But what you're looking at is front and center. You're not looking at the background, and it's very clear what you're seeing because it's right in the front, in the foreground. Whereas in Romantic painting, and think of a Monet, Impressionist painting, it starts to become, you know what I mean by, can you visualize Monet paintings? Mm-hmm. It becomes, the light is more shadowy, it's less bright, and it's more obscure. And the obscurity of the expression expresses the feelings intruding upon the thoughts. That's what's being expressed through the painting there, the depiction. And it expresses the ideal of the period, which is that the feelings are at least as, actually, if not more important than what is being depicted. My feelings about what I'm seeing are as important, if not more important, than what I'm describing. So the internal world, the psychological world, becomes of preeminent importance in the Romantic period and everything thereafter. So this is the beginning of the interest in psychology. And the discipline of psychology emerges out of the Romantic movement, I would say. Well, I can tell you that there is no discipline called psychology before this period. There's also no discipline of sociology or anthropology. They don't exist. These are new so-called human sciences. They appear only thereafter. So the emphasis on expression and self-expression and feelings and imagination. Now, to this day, when people write, they think that what they are doing is expressing themselves. Has anyone not thought that? That's what you're doing. I want to express myself. That is not something that would have occurred to somebody before the Romantics. That's not what you're doing. You're not trying to express yourself. You're trying to depict something else. That's what you're trying to do through words. But now we don't think that way. That's because we're the children of the Romantics. So this is a revolutionary period, and the revolution has not stopped, is what I want to say. Yes?
So what would be the difference between the mirror idea of representing an idea versus trying to express yourself? Is not trying to express yourself still representing an idea?
It's representing yourself. Well, what is yourself then? Yourself is something that can't be seen. So expressing yourself is expressing something that is invisible to the world outside. So it's something internal. And it's the light within you is coming out. And yeah.
So when you wrote ideas under the mirror part, that's more so like an idea.
Probably,
outside of
yeah,
you.
maybe it's more, ideas is used in a different sense, I agree. So ideas are also not seen as what you're saying. Yeah, I see. I think both of them depict ideas, but they do it in a different way. Here they assume that images conform to ideas in the Platonic sense. So there's a world we see around us, just like in the allegory of the cave, and it roughly corresponds like shadows to the real thing. Remember the allegory of the cave? Did you do it with me? Some of you did it with me. You didn't. So there's the world is, we look around at it and we think we live in the real world, but really we're like prisoners strapped in chairs looking at the back of a cave, and there's a light behind us that's throwing a picture, a shadow play in front of us, and we think that that's the real world until we're freed from that situation by philosophy, says Plato, and are brought out into the light, at which point we realize that we were trapped in a cave and we were only living in something like the Matrix. It wasn't the real world, but now it is. But it's the shadow, and the shadow roughly, having said that, roughly corresponds to the real world. It's not that there's no correspondence, but it's just a shadowy thing. And the Platonic word for the real world is the world of ideas. That's a little confusing, technical term. So Platonic, the images conform to those Platonic ideas, so the physical and the metaphysical. Whereas now, ideas are something that we construct ourselves out of nothing. So the Romantic word imagination means literally, in the same sense that we talk about God creating everything out of nothing, the Romantics imagine something that isn't there and think that it's creative. So it's a very strong claim for creativity. That's another distinctive here. Huge emphasis in this period on creativity. By which they mean originality. Something that's never been done before, which we still, again, think is the essence of good art. Originality. Which is why we keep coming up with new music every year. You got to sing a new song in your church. You can't sing that song. That we sang that song last year. Let's sing a new song. How come? What was wrong with the old song? Oh, I don't know. Well, actually, I didn't like that old song either, but I didn't necessarily like the new one any better. I'm going to open this because it's smoking hot here. Or is that a bit hot? Tape shut? Ha. Not. Optical Illusion. That was just to keep you trapped. Are you going to die? Yeah. Try and perish quietly. No, let me know and I'll close it if it gets too cold. But it is about 78 in here. It really is warm.
I'm so sleepy.
Can you confirm that? Yeah. So those are the broad characteristics. Let's look at this poem. Lines written a few miles above Tintern Abbey, on revisiting the banks of the Wye during a tour, July 13th, 1798. One of the typically long descriptive titles of the period. It's not very punchy as a title. By the way, that's the title of the poem. That lines composed. Now it's known as Tintern Abbey by everyone who talks about it. So here it is. It's Tintern Abbey, right? You don't have to write the title. But that's his title. Now, you need to know something about this here before we come to write it, and I think it's important information. And let me show you Tintern Abbey. I assume that nobody here has been to Wales and seen Tintern Abbey. So there it is.
That's so cool.
So there is Tintern Abbey. What do you notice about Tintern Abbey? It's a ruin. It's an abandoned abbey. So in the medieval period, by the way, the Romantics loved, just like the Gothic movement, loved medieval settings. Pre-scientific age settings. Pre-civilized settings. So there's, a along with children, there was a strong emphasis on natives as heroes, or primitive cultures as heroes. Anything pre-rational and scientific. A lot of mysticism in the period. Spirituality takes on a new significance in this period, and a belief in those sorts of things. But this is a ruin. And it was a ruin when Wordsworth visited it as well. So so it wasn't intact when he visited it. And furthermore, it was composed a few miles above Tintern Abbey, as you can see here. So he's not even looking at it. Let me tell you something about the ruin as a typical romantic landscape. Because from this period onwards, ruins become, as I say, typical romantic landscapes. Why? Well, because they illustrate the aesthetic category of interest to the Romantics, which is the Sublime. Let me take a little...
Have you ever been there?
I have not. I've been to ruins like it, because they are all over England, but I have not been to Tintern Abbey itself, I'm afraid. One day I will, though. Because it's, where is it? There we go. This is from a writer by the name of Edmund Burke, Philosophical Inquiry into the Origin of Our Ideas of the Sublime and the Beautiful, 1757. And he will talk of the sublime. Okay. What does he say about this? Whatever is fitted in any sort to excite the ideas of pain and danger, whatever is in any sort terrible, whatever is conversant about terrible objects, or operates in a manner analogous to terror, is a source of the sublime. That is productive of the strongest emotion which the mind is capable of feeling. I say the strongest emotion because I'm satisfied the ideas of pain are much more powerful than those which enter on the part of pleasure. So the idea of pain, anything that suggests pain to us, will be a source of the sublime. And one of the things then that will create this is obscurity. Power, terror, privation, vastness, infinity. Obscurity is one of the more famous ones. To make anything very terrible, obscurity seems in general to be necessary. When we know the full extent of any danger, then we can accustom our eyes to it. A great deal of the apprehension vanishes. Why? Because our imagination of something is far worse than the actual thing. So in the movie Jaws, when you hear the dun, 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 and you know that the shark's under the water, but you don't see it, it's absolutely terrifying. And when the fin comes up, that's scary. It's more scary when the fin goes down. Well, that's actually what sharks do. So when the fin disappears, now it's really scary, because that means the shark's coming is going to pop back up at you, right? But the sound of it, same in horror movies. When you hear the sound, the music, and you're in the dark, and you know the figure's going, and they're going around the corner, scariest moment is when they're just about to go around the corner, right? Why? Because your imagination is a powerful thing, more powerful and more terrifying than anything that you would actually see.
And they have the suspenseful music.
They have the suspenseful music as well that goes along with it to milk it. But you don't actually need the music, per se. Terrified. You know, I've been scared walking around in the dark and you hear a creaking noise. You know, what's that? I mean, even you're an adult. It's like, what? I mean, my daughter last night was scared because she heard a noise in the window. I think it was the wind rattling or something like that. She thought it was a raccoon outside, which would say, well, it's still outside even if it is a raccoon, so why would you be afraid? But, okay. Because she's afraid. Her imagination was, there's something there, and I don't... Now, if I was able to see a raccoon, this is not scary. It's outside, and it's a little raccoon. So even if it's a killer raccoon, it's outside. This is not scary, but the sound and the imagination, this is scary. So when there's obscurity or uncertainty, these things create a powerful effect of fear. And obscurity is one of those. And he says, for this reason, in religion and despotic governments, which are founded on the passions of men, principally use the passion of fear. They keep their chief out of the public view. So you never get to see the dictator. Because to see him is to see a man. As soon as you see a man, you're not terrified. But if you only hear his voice and he doesn't appear in public, far more terrifying. Same like the villain in say, a horror movie. When you don't see the bad guy, you're terrified. When he appears finally, even if he's Jason or whatever. By the way, Jason works because he's kind of behind a mask. As soon as he takes the mask off, it doesn't matter how ugly he is. It's not as bad as the mask. It's the mask that's hiding. So there might be something even more horrible behind the mask. So it's that thing. And one of the things that Tintern Abbey then will do is it depicts something that isn't present and yet is everywhere suggested. And what is suggested in a ruin is the power of nature, which has been seen on the... Now, this was constructed to last for centuries, and it still stands. But it's a ruin now. It suggests the power of nature. A great power. And by the way, the Romantics are all nature poets as well. They all emphasize the importance of originality, of nature, of the imagination, and of the power of all three of those things, which work almost in synchronicity. But here he's only imagining it. Now, so let me come to the poem itself, back to the poem again. These are lines composed a few miles above Tintern Abbey. In other words, he's not looking at it. And in fact, he's remembering it. 5 years have passed. 5 summers with the length of 5 long winters. And again I hear these waters, rolling from their mountain springs with a soft inland murmur. Once again I behold these steep and lofty cliffs that on a wild, secluded scene impress thoughts of more deep seclusion and connect the landscape with the quiet of the sky. The day has come when I again repose here, under this dark sycamore, and view these plots of cottage ground, these orchard tufts, which at this season, with their unripe fruits, are clad in one green hue, and lose themselves mid groves and copses. Once again I see these hedgerows, hardly hedgerows, little lines of sportive wood run wild, these pastoral farms green to the very door, and wreaths of smoke sent up in silence from among the trees. With some uncertain notice, as might seem, of vagrant dwellers in the houseless woods, or of some hermit's cave, where by his fire the hermit sits alone. Let me ask you a question. Those first 22 lines or so, what's the impression that you get from the lines? Just the first thing, yes.
Pasture and distant forests, and he's by himself, describing nature.
Okay, so all the things that I said in a sense, he's isolated,
Yeah.
he's in the presence of nature. And what does he notice though? And what else did you say?
It's in pasture and forests, distant forests.
Okay, so the greenery of nature, the isolation of the individual, other things. What else jumps out? It's under a dark sycamore. Romantics are always under dark sycamores. They are. Sycamores have a blotchy trunk. I guess that's why. Symbol of obscurity. Anything else?
Like Solomon, as in, like his dog, unripe food,
Good.
houseless, like it's very empty.
Good. So it's desolate. Right? There's a sense of, no, it's good. And note that he also refers to a hermit's cave. Well, hermits live on their own, right? So at the end of that, vagrant dwellers in the houseless woods, or of some hermit's cave whereby his fire the hermit sits alone. Well, of course he does. You ever seen a hermit in a company? He wouldn't be a hermit, right? So it's redundant. In fact, the whole description is redundant. It's one redundancy on top of another one. There's an emphasis on things that don't need to be emphasized. So let me illustrate. He talks about the wreaths of smoke sent up in silence from among the trees. Let me ask you a question. What does smoke sound like? No, nothing. Of course it doesn't. Smoke doesn't make a noise. Smoke's something you see. Yes, but he's made you listen to the sound of something that makes no sound. He's made you think about the seclusion of somebody, of course, who is secluded. It's redundancy. But the effect of the redundancy is to pull you deeper into the scene, to make you more attentive. You're leaning in. You're hearing things that you can't hear. And now you're seeing things you can't see. Yes?
So he means to say that it's like a vast area he's staying in because it's so quiet you can hear smoke.
Well, he can't literally hear it,
Yeah,
but he observes that the smoke is going up in silence.
so the fact that he's saying he could hear it just emphasizes the fact that it's like,
So it's emphasizing the silence of the scene and the absence of the scene. And now this is going to be important, but this is, remember he's doing this in remembrance. He's not actually describing it as he sees it, but this is 5 years have passed, and this is a famous line, by the way. 5 summers with the length of 5 long winters. Well, what's the difference between a summer and a winter? I mean, it's both a season. Which one seems longer? Well, particularly now, right? I mean, snow. But so why do summers seem shorter and winters seem longer? By the way, in England, the summers are longer than the winters, or at least the same. In Canada, no. I mean, winters seem to go on for a very long time. We almost get no spring, and then immediately it's hot. But there, the summers seem long, and because it's compared to a winter. Well, winter it seems long because it's all dead, and you're waiting for the new life to begin, and that's how long it seemed. It's only 5 years. 5 summers with the length of 5 long winters. What a wonderful way of describing the length, a longer 5 years than it actually was. And again, I hear, the emphasis on hearing, I hear these waters rolling from their mountain springs. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard this or not. Certainly in Ontario, it's as flat as a pancake, so you don't ever hear anything coming down from mountains, springs. But if you've been near any place with a mountain spring, I don't know, Hamilton? I mean, it's not a mountain, but they call it the mountain. But I mean,
The escarpment?
the escarpment, yeah, sure, right. So anywhere where water can trickle down, you can hear that sound. It's very quiet, but you can hear it, particularly if there's no background noise, which in his day, I mean, they don't have cars or there's no motorized vehicles at all. And you can hear that. And the sound, though, is very quiet. And the emphasis on quiet, so let me draw your attention to these things. So there's a soft inland murmur, and the murmur is almost as if it's speaking, as if the natural world is speaking. And once again do I behold these steep and lofty cliffs that on a wild, secluded scene impress thoughts of a more deep seclusion. What on earth is that? How can you be more secluded than secluded? I don't know, but that's what he's describing. The thought is even more secluded than the scene is. So it's an internal world that he's describing. He's describing his imagination, in other words. Right? Being in the presence of an absence brings to the fore something that you weren't aware of before, which is powerful, which is your imagination. Just like in a dark room where there's nothing there, but you imagine it's there, the fact that there's nothing there makes you think that there's something there. And this scene, which is void of anything, makes you aware of your imagination, which is a greater power, and he's going to talk about how powerful the imagination is then. Yes?
I was just going to say, so is he the Greek definition of stupid?
Idiot? Yes, in a sense. The idiot in the sense of only aware of his private life. Private life is by definition not accessible to the public. Like what I'm thinking right now, or what you're thinking right now, nobody else in the room knows unless you have a power to read somebody's mind. right? But it's the internal world. And an idiot is somebody who has what we call now autism. Autism is just saying the same thing. It's yourself. Auto is yourself. So an autistic person is sort of self-absorbed but doesn't seem to respond to the world around them the same. There's an internalization. So yes, he's been brought into a form of idiocy, if you will. I just don't want to use that because it sounds like I'm being pejorative. I mean, it could be pejorative, but that's not the purpose here, is to address the internalization that is going on. And he's drawing our attention to something that poets before are not interested in, the life within a person. Subjectivity, if you will. So if the mirror is objectivity, the lamp is subjectivity. The Romantic movement, if you will, is the beginning of postmodernism. The early beginnings of postmodernism and the problems of subjectivity begin in the Romantic period. But note all of the references, I'm going to draw your attention to this now, to silence in this. Now, there are different ways of doing it. One of them is that he repeatedly refers to the quiet. So they connect, so in all that seclusion, line 7, they connect the landscape with the quiet of the sky. Again, what sound do skies make? They don't make a noise. But now he is listening to something that makes no noise and attentive to the sound of the silence. And he's under this, and he says all these things blend in together. And the smoke goes up in silence. And there's a hermit in the woods by his fire, and he sits alone. So seclusion, emptiness, vacancy, all of which Burke talks about here as aspects of sublimity, privation, vastness, infinity, such things, right? So this is a sublime landscape, in other words. It's a place where power is evident, because remember, this is again, Tintern Abbey is this place where power, the power of nature has been quietly seen. That abbey was not destroyed by intruders. It was destroyed slowly by wind and rain over centuries, till all that was left was the ruin. And you can see the stones probably are hollowed out, the limestone, by the wind blowing against them. And there's stones that were once like this have now got hollows in them and holes, and the roof's gone off it, and you can see that there's green on the floor. It's a symbol of the power of nature over human artifice. And then also typical of the period is to see nature as a sort of a divine power like Mother Nature. Do you have a question or a comment? No? Okay. One final thing I want to draw your attention to. He starts to use, and it becomes more prominent in the next section, this punctuation mark, which will become more common thereafter, which is a long dash. It's not a hyphen. You can see it in line 3, or 4 rather, here, but you will also see it in the second stanza repeatedly. Now in that long dash, there's a pause, and the pause is there to reflect. It's not punctuation of the words, it's a pause to talk about the silence, the absence of words in seeing this. So the pause is as important as the words themselves. So all of the purpose of Wordsworth's depiction here is to get us to imagine what he's imagining, and he's imagining his imagination. That's the effect of it, to think about things that we don't normally think about. And we think about our power of imagination, imagine things that are absent as if they were present. Yes?
So all these things are happening like in his imagination?
Yes.
But he said
and in ours, but because of the depiction, we're sort of thinking, the
Yeah.
quiet of the sky? And then you think about it, and I can't hear that, but I can imagine the quiet of the sky. And that's the point, the power of the imagination.
So it's like, it said 5 years ago, so was he just saying like, made that up? Like, oh yeah, 5 years ago I did this, or was he like there? And did he see these
No,
things?
I think he actually
Or
was. I mean, I think he...
So it's like, that'd be kind of random to say 5 years ago if he's never done it.
It would be, although he
But-
could imagine it,
and
and
I
it
can
wouldn't
imagine,
matter.
Yeah.
But I think he actually had been on tours of Wales, because northern Wales is not far from where Wordsworth lived, up in the Lake District. Yes?
So then you're saying that the way that we romantic poetry then?
Absolutely.
Like using an EM dash instead of commas and kind of,
It is an EM dash. That's exactly what it is.
yeah.
Not many people know it, so yes, it is. Yeah, yeah.
But that, like, changing our thinking and not really being aware of it?
I think that the way that we write is a reflection of a worldview. It's not just a different mode of expression. It expresses a whole new worldview there. And Wordsworth's worldview is that what is imagined is more real than what is seen. It's the basis for all of that. He's going to emphasize so strongly the power of the human imagination that he's going to think that all good poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. Direct quote, by the way. This is in his preface to Lyrical Ballads. I will write this for you. All good poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling. I think we may come to this text next class. What is wrong with this description of poetry, by the way?
Excludes a lot of good poetry.
That's true. And that's what his contemporary Coleridge said in critique of it, by the way. That was one of the first things he said. Even if it's true of Wordsworth's poetry, it's not true of all good poetry. That's ridiculous. So you give me a very strong universal statement. All good poetry is that. And Coleridge says nonsense, not true. What else do you note about it, though? I think it'll probably surprise. Yes?
Spontaneous?
Well, there's a bit of that as well. What's with the spontaneous business? What does it suggest?
That it can't be meditated and reflected.
Thought about, preconceived,
On spot.
planned. It's just a response. It's a powerful, strong feeling. That's what you write when you're 5. And it's not very good. And Wordsworth's poetry is not a reflection of this, because he's a good writer. Yes?
So he wrote that quote.
That's his quote,
But
yes.
then in his poem, he kind of does a reflection, so that means it's not spontaneous.
Agreed. Well, then he talks about, so he goes on with this, and then he talks about the reflection that comes afterwards, and so it's been meditated upon a bit, and then it gets passed. So he admits that obviously it's absurd, the statement he's just made, so he takes it all back. But it begins, it's this, and then it becomes slightly altered a little bit with a little reflection meditation. But really it's this. In the essence, it's the spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling. So you've immediately picked up the absurdity, and he recognizes the absurdity of it, but he's still making that is the core statement he's making. But the most shocking thing of all is not just the spontaneity, which is also ridiculous. It's the fact that he says that poetry is what? Where is the object here?
Feeling.
You got it. Poetry is feeling.
Technically, it would overflow the object, but he's talking.
Correct. It's an overflow feeling. So you're right, it can be this or that, but the overflow refers to the feeling, so really it is the feeling. The poetry is the feeling expressing itself, flowing out, shining out like a lamp, hence the mirror and the lamp. But that's what poetry is. Would you say that a good description of writing at all is that poetry is feeling, or writing is feeling, or that art is feeling? Is that what he's announcing? That the real thing that we are describing is not ideas, it's feelings, or rather feelings are the essential reality, which psychologists will have a field day with. The whole discipline of psychology is based on feelings. And then they have to have the Jordan Petersons in their ranks try and push back the craziness of the original assertion. I won't go off on psychology for now. Save that for another time. Let me carry on with this here, because having given that original opening there, so it's the 5 years are past, and now he's back in the presence of that Tintern Abbey, and now he then proceeds forward. Next stanza. These beauteous forms, through a long absence, have not been to me as is a landscape to a blind man's eye, but oft in lonely rooms and mid the din of towns and cities I have owed to them in hours of weariness sensations sweet, felt in the blood and felt along the heart, and passing even into my purer mind with tranquil restoration. E.M. Feelings too of unremembered pleasure, such perhaps as have no slight or trivial influence on that best portion of a good man's life, his little nameless, unremembered acts of kindness and of love. Nor less, I trust, to them I may have owed another gift, of aspect more sublime, that blessed mood in which the burthen of the mystery, in which the heavy and the weary weight of all this unintelligible world is lightened. That serene and blessed mood in which the affections gently lead us on, until the breath of this corporeal frame and even the motion of our human blood, almost suspended, we are laid asleep in body and become a living soul, while with an eye made quiet by the power of harmony and the deep power of joy, we see into the life of things. Okay. Important pivot. So he talks about, so the first stanza, he is now looking at Tintern Abbey and talking about the 5 years that have passed between the last time he saw it and the time he has seen it now, and how the landscape there, which suggests an absence. Remember, even the Abbey draws to mind what isn't there as much as what is there, and therefore it's a potent vehicle for the imagination. I can imagine something that isn't there because I can see the outline of it.